Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is keiran.pedley. On this month's podcast, we're going to be talking about the three Bs, the budget, boats and Boris, as we look at the key stories making the headlines in Westminster in the last couple of weeks and what the numbers tell us about what's happening and what might happen in the future. And who better to join me to do that than my esteemed colleagues, Holly.day and Cameron.garrett. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Keiran.
Hi, Keiran.
We're going to try and keep this a bit sort of back and forth this time. What we're going to do is each one of us is going to pick a topic to sort of talk over a little bit, and then we'll sort of see what we think. I suppose, Holly, in a way, the budget's a good place to start because that was last week and clearly is a very important event. What was your takeaway from it?
Yes, we've had a week now to digest the spring budget. Obviously, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt came out last week announcing his new raft of policies and thoughts. In terms of the headlines, I guess it was a lot quieter than the budgets we've had in recent times. That would be my key takeaway. We've had a couple of budgets recently that stick in the memory of having quite a lot of noise around them, some big repercussions. The headlines for me and the data this week would be that people are sitting on the fence. There's just generally been a bit of a neither nor reaction. So generally people are feeling kind of less concerned about their finances and about the economy, but also they're feeling less reassured. So I'm interested to hear you guys try and unpick what we think about each of those arguments.
It's definitely a more boring budget, so to speak, and that's not supposed to be a criticism necessarily. In fact, I think that a period of sort of solid, boring government, so to speak, with as little controversy as possible, probably won't hurt Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt too much. They do have a long way to come back on the economy, though. I mean, our political monitor in the back end of last month had sort of 2/3, around 64%, saying that Sunak's government's doing a bad job managing the economy. That's not going to change overnight. That's going to be very much an incremental fix if it can be fixed at all. But yeah, I mean, I think that having something that steady as she goes to some extent can benefit things. But obviously, they've got a long way back, haven't they?
Yeah, Holly's definitely understating it when she's saying there's been some lively budgets recently when you think the last one was the mini budget and then like an emergency. The first one from Jeremy Hunt where he came in to try and calm the storm almost. But I think it is interesting when you actually look at some of the policies he announced individually. They're quite well supported by the public. So abolishing the work capability assessment for workers claiming disability benefits, for example, 47%, increasing defence spending 46%. Lots of them are supported, basically. I won't read out a whole list because I don't want to bore you all to death. But I think that's interesting when you look, then when you cut at the overall mood music, people are kind of a bit meh about it, even though underlying they do support the policies. What do people think's going on there?
I mean, I think what I found particularly interesting was the number of policies and things that caught the headlines are the things that specifically the Conservatives at the moment, they're trying to tackle this inactivity in the workforce issue that they're grappling with. Lots of people are off long-term sick and disabled. There's lots of kind of older people, 50 plus, choosing to not go back to work for various reasons. So what struck me were the fact that they were majoring particularly on that childcare policy, for example, as an attempt to try and get maybe younger mums or mums in general back into the workforce who currently are having to either work part-time or not going back to work because they've got younger children. So for that to stand out as kind of the main policy takeaway in a budget, I think was a bit of a milestone. It's not something I've seen headlining as a headline coming out of a budget before. And the other thing that stood out, which obviously Labour have been trying to major on in terms of their attack plan back at what came out in the budget, was this raising of the threshold of how much money you can put in your pensions until you have to pay an additional amount of tax. And the Conservatives were trying to make the point that there are lots of doctors, for example, who have decent salaries, who are leaving the workforce at a particular age because it doesn't make sense for them to, they're almost kind of losing money. It doesn't make sense for them to continue to work versus retiring at that point. So raising that threshold means that they're trying to convince doctors to stay in the NHS for longer. Obviously, Labour say you're not targeting this at doctors. This is just at people who are earning lots of money. So they have been able to get their teeth into one of the policies. But for me, it did strike me that there were a number of policies in there aimed specifically at trying to tackle this issue of inactivity.
I think it's coming down to delivery now. I mean, we're looking ahead to the next general election, and obviously we don't know When exactly that will be, we know it has to be essentially next year. I think technically it can maybe be in January 2025 by some sort of accident of maths, but I don't really expect it to be that. So you're looking at an election next year. At the moment, our most recent political monitor had Labour 6 points ahead on the economy by 30 to 24. Certainly not insurmountable, though. But at the same time, there's a lot of policies in there that might be quite popular. And we'll come to this with the boats point later. But I think ultimately, where the Tories are going to be vulnerable at the next election is to this idea that you've been in power 14 years, you've had all this time to fix these things. So where I think they face a challenge in terms of turning polling around is if you're bringing in policies that might well be popular but aren't necessarily going to come in straight away, there might be a credibility gap in the minds of voters, even if that's not justified, let's say, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't, because people won't see it straight away. I mean, anecdotally, as someone with a 3-year-old at nursery, the childcare policy won't affect me or my child, but you talking to other parents outside nursery and that sort of thing, and a lot of the ones that it would affect are delighted at that policy. But it's a big deal. But then overnight there was people clamoring, oh, when's this coming in, that sort of thing. And part of that's a comms thing, but part of that's if you're going to announce something like this, to feel the political benefit, I suspect if you're 14 years into office, you're going to need to show, not tell. And so I think that's the big challenge for Sunak in the next year. We talked before about how his polling has not been dreadful. It's been falling in the last couple of months, don't get me wrong. But I still think there is an inherent benefit of the doubt that he gets in a way that a lot of frontline Tory politicians don't at the moment. But he does need to show that he can actually deliver.
And I think that's where some of the particular polling we've done recently on who the public are currently blaming for the economic situation really strikes me, because we're still seeing that these global external factors are featuring at the top. 78% of people are blaming COVID, 3/4 the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and just factors to do with the global economy is up there in third as well. But what I've found particularly interesting recently is that there's an increasing number of people blaming Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, 13 years of Tory government, Brexit, and Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt themselves. So the two things that rose recently in our polling and were climbing up that list since November were the percentage of people blaming Brexit for the economic problems and the percentage of people blaming Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt directly for those problems. So if people are starting to turn their attention to what's happening now and who they're thinking is responsible for what they're feeling now, and the current government are taking the hit, that's problematic for them, given a lot of these policies coming out of the budget, as you said, Keiran, have a bit more of a long-termist view, and the public want to see action and tangible benefits to themselves, their incomes and their pockets as we speak.
But it's not, what I would also say is that Labour will eventually, I'm sure they know this, but Labour will eventually need to show a compelling economic narrative and set of policies themselves too. Our polling post-budget had a question that struck me. The data isn't particularly different to what it's always been, but I mean, as we get closer to an election, I think it's worth dwelling on. So how confident, if at all, are you that the Conservatives have a good long-term economic plan for Britain? 29% confident, 61% not confident. Obviously bad numbers, as you can slice and dice the numbers however you like with different questions on the Tories' reputation on the economy. We know it's negative at the moment. But with Labour, 35% confident, 51% not confident. Now, those numbers are better than the Conservatives. And you could argue that ultimately it's a binary choice. Yes, it's a multi-party system, but in terms of who forms the next government. So perhaps the fact that people aren't overwhelmingly positive about Labour won't matter as long as they're more positive towards them, generally speaking, than they are to the Conservatives. But it is still a warning sign for Labour if they go into an election where, I don't know, hypothetically speaking, let's say the Tories cut taxes at the next year's budget in some way. Yes, there can be a row about, well, you put them up in the first place, etc., etc. But if the Conservatives go into the next election promising to cut taxes or having cut them, and then fighting that age-old general election campaign saying Labour will put your taxes up, which is a historic brand weakness for Labour, you can see how quite quickly Labour could get tangled up depending on how they respond. So at some point, there is going to have to be an economic message from Labour that has meat on the bones. What that's going to be, we don't know. But you can't just take it for granted that because people are upset with the Tories, that necessarily means Labour can just sit there and count their winnings.
I think also, just to go back to the mood music of the whole country, whilst people kind of mere budget, support some policies in it, I think the economy, 79% are still saying it's poor. And the focus of getting people back into work in this budget, there is an irony of the fact on the same day teachers were outside Westminster striking, you had doctors striking that same week, and it's kind of, what's missing from the budget? What are we doing to get these people back into work too, and not striking and answering some of those more general issues in society?
There are some deals being done, though. I mean,
there are now. Yeah.
It does seem like there was. I've only been sort of following this peripherally at the moment, but I think there's some RMT deal. Nurses deal. There was some sort of NHS deal, was it, in the works as well? And look, I mean, I don't think that's going to lead to necessarily a massive boost for Sunak, the deal maker, or something. But I think like the absence of those strikes, if there is a period where there is an absence, again, it creates that sort of boring stability that may well see an incremental change in the polling. I know that there was some polling yesterday that suggested not an incremental change, but I think that the most likely outcome is like, I don't know, air going in the balloon slowly or something for the Tories. Let's talk a bit about boats, because that was another topic recently. So there was a recent summit between Rishi Sunak and President Macron of France, which got somewhat overshadowed, I think it's fair to say, by Gary Lineker Gate. So we could talk a bit about that, because there's sort of in some ways both stories were two sides of the same story, but in some ways they weren't as well. So this is all about people coming over on boats across from France and rows about the legality of that. Try to choose my language carefully, and what should be done with those people, and so on and so forth. And the Home Secretary Suella Braverman's been in Rwanda promoting a scheme related to that. So without getting into the weeds of the policy itself, what do we think about the broader topic of the boats policies and immigration? Because I suppose on the one hand, we know that the cost of living and public services and things like that have traditionally been the focus of the public's minds in the last sort of year or so and beyond. But on the other hand, we do know the importance of this issue to that Brexit coalition that won the Conservatives such a big majority at the last election. And so any chance that this issue might sort of rebuild that coalition, at least to some extent, is obviously going to be politically beneficial to the Conservatives too. So I don't know who wants to jump in on that, but what do we think about this issue and how it might play out politically?
Yeah, for me, I think you hit the nail on the head with your second point there, Kieran. They're not speaking to the public at the minute. I think they're trying to be speaking to their 2019 base at the minute. When you look at what they're prioritising.
They're the public too, though, aren't they?
Yeah, no, they are. But they're trying to win them back, basically, I think, and win back their trust, which they've been losing. And they've been going to don't knows, etc., in voting intention. And I think they're trying to claw some of them back. So when you look at the public as a whole, this isn't necessarily a public priority. So we polled Sunak's 10 pledges, and it was coming at the bottom of the 10 pledges, essentially. But it's disproportionately more important to 2019, their Conservative base. And you can see, whilst it's not necessarily seeping through into voting intention yet, this policy and getting the 2019 Conservatives back, depending on what polls you look at, as you say, there's been some interesting ones out recently on underlying issues such as having the right immigration policies. You can see it has won them back quite quickly. And we've seen a 24% leap among Conservative voters in the Conservatives having the right immigration policies after this was announced. So you can see it's the right kind of direction that is going to attract back these 2019 Conservative voters. I don't think it's necessarily enough, and that's why we're not seeing that change in voting intention yet, but you can see it's starting to pull them together.
And it's ramping up because it's not just Rishi Sunak standing in front of his fancy new podium with his slogan on it. As you said, Suella Braverman's been in Rwanda in the past couple of days, encouraging members from the opposite side of the House to get over there and look at all the fancy new things that are being built. It's clearly top of mind for a significant number of people as part of the cabinet and government at the minute to try and get maybe not the underlying policy message across, but just the core of the argument of what they're attempting to achieve. And I think the bilateral meeting in France, the first for 5 years, obviously there's been a lot of things going on with Brexit in the past few years and various different prime ministers not particularly getting on with President Macron. I think that was a significant step and a significant milestone that Rishi Sunak went there. They extended meetings, I believe, beyond the time allocation that they originally occasionally had some lovely lunches. I always find it interesting looking at the weird and wonderful menus that people eat at these sorts of things.
I imagine lunch at the with the French president probably won't be too bad, will it?
It's vegetarian sushi apparently, so like sea themed,
okay.
which is.
I was thinking a nice entrecôte or something, you know.
No, they were on sea themed food, so I think they were on vegetarian sushi and then turbot. So I don't know if that was part of the PR plan as well, but I think the fact that they managed to get this kind of multi-annual financial framework, which they snappily called it, off the back of it, to kind of jointly tackle these channel crossings, to pump some money into things like these detention centres. Like Rishi Sunak is really trying to make it seem either to his base, to the public, or to his own colleagues, quite frankly, that he is trying to tackle this issue, he is trying to take it seriously, and that he's going to take strong action on it. I think the issue might come when the public are wanting to see tangible results. So there's a bit of a way to go on that, I think.
I was going to say, I know Kieran's going to be delivery. I know you're interested in that, Kieran.
Yeah, but I mean, on your point about bringing the topic back to boats, Cameron, I'm not sure you get great sushi in the English Channel, but I haven't actually sort of delved into that particularly. But we digress. Yeah, I mean, the delivery points, I bang the drum a lot because there's a lot of argument. There's a lot of hot air. Hot air is maybe a bit extreme, but there's a lot of argument on social media about the importance of this issue and what it means, what it doesn't mean, and so on. It's clearly an important issue. We look at our issues index this month. It's just out today. Top two issues are inflation and the economy on, 39 and 37%, respectively. So this is like when we ask people in their own words, what are the most important issues facing the country? So we don't give them a list. We just say, tell us, and then we code it up. So it's a good way of getting people spontaneous responses. So they're the top two issues, but then immigration has risen up the chart, so to speak, up 8 points from last month. 20% put that as a top issue. That's essentially joint third with the NHS and healthcare, which is on 21%, which has fallen a little bit. So this is like an overall, as you said earlier, Karen, it's a sort of second tier issue for the public as a whole. But then when you look at Conservative voters, it's essentially joint second with the cost of living and inflation. With the economy number one. So there's plenty of evidence that this is something that motivates Conservative voters, but it will come back to what extent is there a perception that the votes have been stopped or at least significantly reduced in a way that people notice ahead of the next election. Because when you look at the polling, a recent poll we did at Ipsos said to what extent, if at all, do you trust the following parties to have the right, let's pick one at random, handle the issue of migrants crossing the channel. You had 59% saying they did not trust the Conservatives very much or not at all, with 33% saying they trusted them a great deal or a fair amount. The issue, though, for Labour, again, is that 54% don't trust Labour either. So this is one of those issues that people just don't particularly believe that the parties can deliver, either party can deliver on this issue. And one of the points I always say to people is that much like Labour people have debated about and argued over the fact that you can't get into an arms race with Nigel Farage, let's say, or the Brexit Party or UKIP or Reform Now over these things, that's true for the Conservatives too, because to me, unless the votes have almost completely stopped or the Conservatives go into the next election saying they're going to pull out of the ECHR, there's always going to be someone making noises that are more more extreme, more tough, whatever language you want to use. So I think that we can argue a lot about the salience of the issue, what it's going to mean for Conservative voters and so on and so forth. And I do think to some extent looking and sounding tough will win some people over regardless. I do think there is something in that. It's a values thing. It's about sort of saying, my values are your values, even if people don't necessarily pay a particular attention to the direction of travel. You do need, again, to show that you can deliver. And I think Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives know that. I mean, that's why he's put his 5 pledges together. It's to sort of set a benchmark that says, here are my 5 pledges, so that presumably a year from now he can say, and this is why I'm delivering, and you should give me 5 more years or something. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be. It's not really. This isn't to me a question of liberal metropolitan elite versus XYZ. This is more of a question of will it work.
I do think also we've seen quite a bit of polling where we need to step back and think about the grand narrative again. And there is an opening, I think, to put forward a positive case for immigration. So to plug some lovely client work we do with King's College and the World Values Survey, which has been running for 40 odd years, the most recent wave has come out and it's showing that we're actually among the most positive towards immigration, Britain, in the world. 58% say we should let people come here if there are jobs available, which makes us equally as positive to Germany and Canada. Only 1% say we should prohibit people coming here altogether in Britain. So there is, and that's changed a lot over the past few decades. So there is something about us becoming more positive and perhaps a case there. But I think it would be dangerous ground for, if you're a political party, I think you're almost the last 5 years has trained you like, oh, I can't be doing that.
And that's why I think it's interesting that it's an omission from Labour. Well, Rishi Sunak came out with his 5 pledges, and then Labour came out with their 5 missions, which is slightly different from pledges in some way, shape, or form. I'm not entirely sure if they all focus grouped the same language and then had to change them at the last minute. But
different agencies probably. Yeah.
It was interesting to me that was an omission from the Labour missions. They're steering clear of that issue. They're kind of almost giving the Conservatives the ground to run with their own narrative on that, and as you said, Cameron, not particularly wanting to touch it, although as you mentioned as well, there are kind of long-term trends in work that we do with our kind of partners at British Future as well that show positivity towards immigration, particularly as you said, to fill work shortages. And when we've polled previously on the delivery element, as you've been talking about, Keiran, people are still keen for an element of compassion and an element of fairness. Even the people who would like these policies to be particularly tough, or they want to see certain levels of action, there is still that kind of theme of fairness and compassion that runs through it that I think we'll be able to see, when these policies are implemented, if they satisfy both of those criteria. But these are long-standing issues, right? These are issues that both parties have been trying to grapple with for a number of years. So we'll see.
Labour will need an answer to this, because even if the Conservatives, so and obviously it's tricky not to conflate asylum boat stuff with immigration. Generally, they are different policy debates, I suppose. Although I'm sort of somewhat sceptical that the types of people that vote one way or t'other on these issues necessarily separate them. But I think as much as I talk about delivery, I stand by that. I still think the Conservatives are going to want to be talking about this at the next election, because I think that they'll want Labour to have to come up with a response. So, what are you going to do about the Rwanda policy? Are you going to scrap it? What signal does that send? What are you going to do instead? Because presumably, if Labour can't just say, well, we're scrapping that and we're just going to process cases a bit quicker. I mean, maybe it will. I don't know. But so I suspect even if the delivery point remains problematic, I find it hard to believe this isn't going to be an issue at the next general election. I'm not saying it'll be the most important, but particularly if the election comes next autumn or something, and you've got the whole summer of where the weather's a bit better, and maybe you're getting more votes for that reason. I don't know. I mean, I'm not clear in my head which works better for this debate. If the Conservatives want to have this fight at the next election, is it better to have it sort of April, May next time, in which case we better get our skates on planning, but or is it better to have it later? But I do think those numbers I talked about earlier did show that Labour isn't especially trusted on this either at all, and it's this sort of issue is part of why a lot of people have switched from Labour to the Conservatives over time as well. We're sort of dancing around the kind of realignment debate and the last general election and some of the issues that drove that result. Let's talk a bit about the architect of that. No, not Mr. Cummings. Let's talk about the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, Freudian slip. Some hope future Prime Minister, but Boris Johnson. So there's the Privileges Committee hearing. I must admit, I've lost track a little bit of when they're reporting, but he's submitted his evidence to that, saying this lunchtime, saying that he essentially misled Parliament, but it was done in good faith.
Yeah.
So what do we think around his popularity? Because I suppose, again, on the one hand, we know that he was ousted from office because The Conservatives were losing popularity very sharply. They were losing by-elections hand over fist. And it was felt that they needed a change. The Conservatives needed a change to recover. But on the other hand, he did win this big majority in 2019. He has had a way in the past of cobbling voting coalitions together that work. It's not clear the Conservatives can do it without him. So, what do we think about the re-emergence of Johnson, and does it hurt Sunak?
So I think he's kind of a looming figure for Sunak, isn't he? Kind of like a king over water type thing, like an alternative that is there. And he polls kind of similar. So we had a poll out this month, our political polls, which polls favourability of politicians. We had 28% favourable to Johnson, 52% unfavourable, so a majority unfavourable. Sunak was on 27% versus 46%, so not far off one another. And Johnson actually has a lead amongst 2019 Conservative voters. You might somewhat expect that, seeing as those voters were the people that elected him. But yeah, 55% to 49% over Sunak. But you've got to remember that Johnson, in his last days in office, he had the ratings of a prime minister on their way out. They were comparable to Theresa May's at the time when she left. He obviously has reinvented himself before, again, throughout the past decade, Mayor of London, Brexiteer, prime minister. But I think it's easy to forget what was happening last summer, and people wanted him gone. Nearly 6 in 10 supported him resigning. 6 in 10 said they didn't trust him to tell the truth. The numbers weren't positive, but I think, yeah, he just always has this narrative of, I won the election, but I don't see him, if he came back, being a vote winner for them necessarily.
You can't, you talked about 6 in 10 not trusting him to tell the truth. Really got to focus on that when you talk about Boris Johnson, because like the trust thing was so important. I was speaking to a journalist yesterday about this. I won't do that name droppy thing, but like ultimately, when you looked at the character of Boris Johnson and what people liked, didn't like, how he compared favourably, unfavourably towards Corbyn and then Starmer, he was always seen as someone that had personality, that was seen as good in a crisis, because, I think people generally, whilst it wasn't overwhelmingly positive during the pandemic, there was a general sense that he was doing a reasonable job there. He did a good job on Ukraine and this sort of thing. So his reputation actually for being in a crisis was pretty strong. Personality is always, he's always been a bit of almost a celebrity politician in some ways, even though he's been a politician for a long time. And patriotism as well is often something that he outpolled Starmer on and Corbyn in the past. So he had these positive traits in terms of the kind of the brand image, but what tanked over time was some of the delivery aspects, but was trust, to the point where it was single digits. I think it was 9% that told us last May that he was more trustworthy than other politicians. And when we were doing polls last summer, before we knew that it was going to be Sunak versus Truss, and before all of that happened, saying, what do you want in the next prime minister? And top of the list at that time was someone that's honest and truthful. And so when this story comes out, and I'm sure we'll poll on it, others will poll on it too, whatever the nuance of the debate about the legality of the process and this sort of stuff that I just don't think means anything to the public, people aren't going to instinctively believe Boris Johnson and his submissions, because they just don't trust him. Mm-hmm. And once you've lost trust, not just lost it, but to that scale, where 6 in 10, I tell you, what was it, Cameron? 6 in 10 said 10, they
6 in 10 don't trust him to tell the truth versus 27% for Starmer. So twice as many don't trust Boris Johnson as Keir Starmer.
Yeah, how often does Boris Johnson tell the truth? 61% say not very often and never. So, I mean, when you've got that degree of a lack of trust, the realignment point and the policies point is secondary. It really is. It's the fact that people just don't believe what you say, don't value your integrity. And again, I've sort of come to this. I'm talking a lot about delivery when it comes to Rishi Sunak. I think for Boris Johnson, it's about this trust issue. Like, people just don't believe a word he says at the moment. So if the Conservatives were ever, I think the ship has probably sailed now. But if the Conservatives were ever to try and put him back in, you can have the manifesto that is the perfect manifesto for the people that you won over in 2019. People aren't going to believe you're going to deliver it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, coming back to the budget point that we were talking about at the start, we were calling it you call it a boring budget, I think, Keiran, without meaning to cause any offence. But these sorts of kind of.
It's all right, I didn't deliver it.
I don't want to call it a sideshow, but these sorts of additional things going on outside of the day-to-day delivery of government are the sorts of things that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt don't want, right? You add to that to the fact that the trust issue is a big problem for them. We've mentioned previously on this podcast our veracity index that comes out every year, and it's scoring how much people trust in different professions. Politicians came right at the bottom. It was about 12%, I think, or something, that of people who have trust in politicians, and it's flagging so far down the list compared to every other profession that we poll on. They don't have a good reputation, and with this privileges committee thing rearing its head again, surely it's just going to dig back up for a lot of people all of the things that remind people why they why we were getting the polling ratings we were getting throughout the last couple of years for the Conservatives. That's exactly the sort of thing that Rishi Sunak doesn't want. So anything that brings that back to the forefront of people's minds, I personally think most people are already going to have their thoughts about it one way or the other. I don't think this is going to change many people's minds, but it might, for the undecideds, bring it back into the forefront of their mind, and that's particularly what the government don't want at the minute, whichever way it goes or however much is revealed in his statement. And from the written statement, I don't think there's anything that particularly came out of that we don't already know. A lot of this debate is going to be on the nuance of particular words that he used at particular times and whether or not the Privilege Committee believe that.
But also whether or not there's going to be a by-election. The sort of, often with these things, I often think to myself, what's the kind of way of reprimanding Johnson without causing that? And I suspect that would be that my default starting position without knowing, obviously, is that there probably won't be a by-election. No, he'll be suspended for like a week or something, or whatever the maximum is that doesn't necessitate some kind of recall possibility / by-election in Uxbridge. But although perversely, if there was a by-election and he lost it, that would probably open him up to stand in a different seat at the next general election. So who says he doesn't play 3D chess? But what do you think, Cameron?
I also think the approach of casting like doubts on the legality of the committee overall, I don't think is necessarily going to cut through. When we polled last August, 3 in 4 told us they thought the committee was justified, and that's including the majority of Conservatives. I also think it's interesting, just as a side note, that this is happening the same week as Trump in America facing calls saying he's going to be arrested this week for all the populism rallying against the institutions that both of these leaders led in very different ways. It's kind of, this is the week that institutions are kind of pushing back a bit. And they're answering to them essentially.
Yes, that because it has the potential. I suspect that the reaction on the streets here to Boris Johnson won't be quite the same as
very different ways.
In America. But last word to you, Holly, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to flag a poll that didn't come out from us, unfortunately, but Conservative Home have been polling activists on this over the past couple of days, and I thought some of the figures that came out of that were quite interesting. That Tory activists do believe he broke lockdown rules. They don't necessarily think he deliberately misled the Commons. They think the majority of them think that the inquiry into him is unfair, but ultimately a majority do not think he should return as leader or prime minister. So despite what they think about the process, despite what they think about the committee or the inquiry, or whether or not they think he broke rules, broke the law, or any of that stuff, Tory activists themselves, a majority of them, don't want to see him come back as leader or prime minister. So I still think, despite, whatever comes out of this inquiry this week, I'm not particularly convinced it's going to convince enough people that he's going to have a change of heart. But I also just wanted to flag, with the local elections coming up in the next couple of months, if the Conservatives take a big hit there, and that sometimes happens when you're in the middle or towards the end of a parliament, dependent on how many people turn out and all of the caveats to do with that sort of stuff, that could shape his decision making as to whether or not he thinks it's worth giving something a go. If it goes particularly badly for Rishi Sunak, he's probably got a little bit of support within the party himself to be able to try and come up with some sort of a coalition in the same way that he did trying to get the 100 MPs together back in the heady days of Liz Truss, which genuinely feels like years ago, but it was like less than 6 months, wasn't it?
And if we've learned anything, never write off Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
No, although the prospect of both of the two main party leaders at the last general election not even being MPs after the next one is certainly not zero, is it? I mean, certainly with Jeremy Corbyn, looks like he's not going to.
And Nicola Sturgeon gone for the SNP.
Yes, I mean, all change. It will be strange if we do get a parliament anytime soon that's 5 years long with the same prime minister all the way through. I mean, that would be boring, wouldn't it? But anyway, we'll have to wait and see what happens next. Holly.day, Cameron.garrett, thank you very much for your time. That was the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. If you like what you hear, please do tell a friend about us, share us on social media or elsewhere, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. But for now, thanks for listening and have a great week.